I'm Marcus Turner, 38, and after 12 years of marriage, I found myself sitting in a courtroom watching my wife walk in with her new boyfriend. Vanessa thought she had orchestrated the perfect betrayal, hiring a lawyer from a prestigious firm to take half of everything I'd built. What she didn't know was that 3 years ago, I quietly became the owner of that very law firm. The universe has a way of delivering unexpected justice. Before I tell you how I managed to turn the tables on my cheating wife, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about justice being served in the most unexpected ways. I met Vanessa 12 years ago at a charity gala in downtown Chicago. The event was raising funds for educational programs in underprivileged neighborhoods, a cause I had always supported through my business ventures. I was 36 then, already establishing myself in business management and strategic investments, but admittedly lacking in my personal life. Vanessa captivated me immediately. She stood across the room in a midnight blue dress, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion about policy reform. Her intelligence radiated through her animated gestures and confident stance. When our eyes met across the crowded ballroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced before, a connection that transcended the physical. I made my way through the crowd, introduced myself, and discovered she was a rising attorney at Jennings & Powell, passionate about corporate law but equally dedicated to pro bono work. Our conversation flowed effortlessly from legal precedents to philosophy to our shared love of historical architecture. By the end of the evening, we had exchanged numbers and made plans for dinner the following week. Our courtship was a whirlwind of intellectual stimulation and romantic gestures. I admired her ambition, how she worked tirelessly toward becoming a partner at her firm while never losing sight of the humanitarian aspects of law. She seemed to appreciate my business acumen and the way I approached acquisitions with both strategic insight and ethical consideration. 6 months after our first meeting, I proposed during a weekend trip to a historical lighthouse on Lake Michigan. Vanessa accepted with tears in her eyes, and we began planning our future together. The wedding took place the following spring at a lakeside venue with 150 guests, a perfect blend of elegance and intimacy. Our first years of marriage were blissful in our modest but charming apartment in Lincoln Park. Vanessa continued climbing the ranks at her law firm while I focused on expanding my portfolio. My specialty had always been identifying struggling businesses with untapped potential, restructuring them, and turning them around. I had a particular talent for seeing value where others saw only failure. In our 3rd year of marriage, an opportunity arose that would unknowingly set the stage for our future confrontation. Bennett & Associates, a mid-sized law firm with an excellent reputation but financial mismanagement issues, was quietly seeking investors to avoid bankruptcy. After thorough analysis, I recognized their client base and attorney talent were exceptional. The problems were purely administrative. I made the acquisition through a holding company, Meridian Ventures, keeping my personal name disconnected from the ownership structure. This wasn't unusual in my business practices. I often maintained privacy in my investments to avoid unnecessary attention. Benjamin Wallace, the founding partner who stayed on as managing director, was one of the few people who knew about my involvement. The restructuring of Bennett & Associates proved successful within the first year. We implemented new financial systems, modernized their technology, and strategically expanded their practice areas. The firm began attracting more prominent clients and talented attorneys. In a twist of irony I couldn't have foreseen, Vanessa expressed dissatisfaction with her current position around this time. During our 5th anniversary dinner at Gibson's Steakhouse, she mentioned wanting a change. "I feel stagnant," she confided, sipping her Cabernet. "The path to partnership seems blocked by politics rather than merit." 2 weeks later, she excitedly announced she'd accepted an associate position at Bennett & Associates, completely unaware of my connection to the firm. I considered telling her then but hesitated. Our careers had always remained somewhat separate by mutual agreement. We both valued independence and wanted to succeed on our own merits. I decided my ownership wasn't relevant to her position, and Benjamin agreed to maintain confidentiality. The first 5 years of our marriage had been marked by deep connection and shared dreams. We had discussed starting a family soon, though both our careers constantly provided reasons to postpone. We traveled extensively, weekend getaways to Michigan's wine country, anniversaries in Paris and Tokyo, a memorable 3-week exploration of Italy's smaller villages. As we approached year 6, subtle shifts began occurring. Vanessa's hours at Bennett and Associates grew longer as she impressed senior partners and took on more complex cases. My business expanded to include technology startups and real estate developments across 3 states. We began seeing each other less, with dinners together becoming weekly rather than daily occurrences. I still believed in our foundation. We were both ambitious people who understood the temporary sacrifices needed for long-term success. Vanessa's determination was part of what had attracted me to her, and I trusted that our connection would withstand the demands of our careers. We still made time for meaningful conversations and intimacy, though less frequently than before. Looking back, I realized now that I had overlooked the warning signs. The growing distance wasn't merely about busy schedules, something fundamental was changing between us. But hindsight brings clarity to what the heart refuses to see in real time. 7 years into our marriage, the cracks that had formed beneath the surface began to widen into undeniable fractures. The nature of our relationship shifted in ways I initially attributed to natural evolution. Conversations that once flowed organically became perfunctory exchanges about schedules and household matters. Weekend mornings once spent lingering over coffee and conversation were replaced by Vanessa's early departures for urgent client meetings. I first noticed the change in her appearance gradually, subtle differences that accumulated over months. New clothing styles appeared in her wardrobe, more modern and daring than her typically conservative professional attire. She began visiting an upscale salon downtown, replacing her classic bob with a longer, more elaborate style. The changes themselves weren't concerning. Everyone evolves. It was the absence of sharing these decisions, the new privacy surrounding her choices, that triggered my unease. The phone became a particular point of tension. Vanessa, once casually open with her communications, began guarding her screen. She took calls in separate rooms, her voice dropping to whispers. Text notifications would draw immediate attention, followed by slight smiles she thought I didn't notice. When I asked casual questions about her day or colleagues, her answers became vague and dismissive. "You wouldn't understand the complexities of the Westbrook merger," she would say, or, "just boring legal talk that would put you to sleep." These deflections stung. We had always engaged intellectually about our work, regardless of differing fields. In February, I had scheduled a week-long business trip to Seattle for meetings with a potential technology acquisition. 2 days into the trip, after an unexpectedly quick conclusion to negotiations, I decided to return home early to surprise Vanessa. I had hoped the spontaneous gesture might help reconnect us. I arrived at our house around 9 in the evening. The lights were on, music playing softly. I entered quietly, thinking to surprise her pleasantly. What I found instead permanently altered the course of our marriage. Vanessa was in our living room with a man I recognized from firm photographs as Roger Blackwell, a partner at Bennett and Associates. They weren't simply having a professional discussion. They were intimately entwined on the sofa we had chosen together during a weekend trip to Michigan's furniture district. The moment crystallized in slow motion. Her lipstick smudged, his hand beneath her blouse, wine glasses on the coffee table beside case files used as the apparent pretext for their meeting. When they noticed me standing in the doorway, suitcase still in hand, their reactions diverged dramatically. Roger jumped up, straightening his clothing with mumbled apologies. Vanessa's response was strikingly different. After initial shock, her expression hardened into something resembling irritation at the interruption rather than guilt at being discovered. "You're supposed to be in Seattle until Friday," she said, as if my adherence to schedule was the relevant issue. The confrontation that followed was surprisingly muted, characterized more by cold calculation than heated emotion. Vanessa offered explanations that insulted my intelligence. They were working late, had a momentary lapse of judgment, it meant nothing. When I asked directly how long the affair had been going on, she refused to acknowledge it as anything ongoing. "You're overreacting," she insisted. "We've both been neglecting our marriage. You can't place all the blame on me for seeking connection elsewhere." I spent that night at the Peninsula Hotel downtown, unable to remain under the same roof. The following days brought attempts at communication that felt like negotiating with a stranger. Vanessa vacillated between defensive accusations about my work schedule and dismissive minimization of what I had witnessed. Not once did she offer a genuine apology or express remorse. When I suggested marriage counseling, her response was immediate and firm. "I don't need someone analyzing my choices or telling me how to feel," she said. "Besides, my schedule doesn't permit weekly therapy sessions." For 3 weeks, I attempted to salvage what remained of our relationship. I adjusted my work commitments, proposed a vacation to reconnect, even sent thoughtful gifts reminiscent of happier times. Each gesture was met with increasing coldness. Vanessa stayed at the office later, sometimes not returning home at all, offering thin excuses about case preparation and client emergencies. The definitive end came during a rare dinner together at home. I had prepared her favorite meal, hoping to create space for honest conversation. Instead, Vanessa arrived 2 hours late, barely touched the cold food, and announced she wanted a divorce. "I deserve more excitement, more passion than this marriage provides," she stated, as if describing an unsatisfactory hotel rather than 12 years together. "We've grown in different directions. It happens." The clinical detachment in her voice struck me more deeply than anger would have. This wasn't a decision reached through anguish or conflict, it was a calculated assessment that our partnership no longer served her ambitions. "I've already consulted with Patricia Morgan at the firm," she continued, referring to a senior divorce attorney at Bennett and Associates. "I'm entitled to half of everything, Marcus. The house, investments, your business interests. Illinois law is quite clear on marital property division." The irony of her hiring an attorney from my own firm to take half my assets might have been amusing in a different context. I considered revealing my ownership then but decided against it. Something in her cold calculation, the premeditated nature of her actions, prompted strategic rather than emotional thinking on my part. "I see," was all I said that evening, unwilling to reveal my thoughts or plans. The following weeks brought formal separation. I moved into a downtown apartment, while Vanessa remained in our home, which I later learned she had invited Roger to visit regularly. Through the firm's administrative channels, I discreetly confirmed she had indeed retained Patricia Morgan, one of Bennett's most aggressive divorce attorneys, known for securing maximum settlements for spouses of successful business owners. What Vanessa didn't realize, what no one at the firm except Benjamin knew, was that every document, every strategy session, every piece of correspondence related to her case ultimately belonged to the company I owned. I hadn't planned this advantage, but I wasn't going to ignore it either. After years of fair dealing in business and 12 years of loyalty in marriage, I found myself facing an adversary rather than a partner. The realization brought clarity rather than additional pain. If Vanessa wanted a business transaction rather than an amicable separation, I would approach it with the same strategic thinking that had built my success. Behind the composed exterior I maintained during our separation, I experienced nights of profound loss and questioning. The emotional devastation hit in waves, driving past our favorite restaurant, finding her forgotten scarf in my suitcase, waking from dreams where our marriage remained intact. These private moments of grief stayed private. I had learned that vulnerability with Vanessa would now be weaponized rather than respected. 3 weeks after moving out, I met with Lawrence Fields, my closest friend since college and now my chief financial officer. We sat in my apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights reflecting off the water as I explained the situation. "She's going for blood, Mark," Lawrence said after reviewing the initial correspondence from Patricia Morgan. "These demands are beyond standard division. She wants controlling interest in Meridian Ventures itself. Can she get it?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Lawrence shook his head. "Not legally, but in divorce courts, anything can happen with the right emotional appeal," Judges are human. If she paints you as the neglectful husband who drove her to infidelity. Which is absurd, I interjected. I have calendar records, texts, everything showing how often she cancelled plans, how much I tried to prioritize our marriage. Evidence helps, but perception matters more sometimes, Lawrence said. What about this Roger guy? What do we know about him? Through discreet channels at the firm, information about Roger Blackwell painted a troubling picture. He had joined Bennett and Associates 2 years earlier, bringing several lucrative clients with him. His professional reputation was strong, but office gossip revealed he and Vanessa had grown close almost immediately upon her joining the firm. More disturbingly, investigation revealed Roger was married with 3 children in Lake Forest, apparently maintaining 2 separate relationships. His wife has no idea, my source confirmed. He tells Vanessa he's separated and finalizing his own divorce, but no paperwork has ever been filed. This information was valuable but presented an ethical dilemma. I had no desire to destroy families or careers out of vengeance, yet I needed to protect myself from Vanessa's aggressive approach. I decided to hold this information in reserve, hoping it wouldn't become necessary to use. Meanwhile, I began meticulously documenting all marital assets, creating comprehensive timelines of business acquisitions, and clarifying which properties and investments predated our marriage. Illinois law distinguished between marital property and individual property, though the lines could blur without proper documentation. My ownership of Bennett and Associates remained my most closely guarded advantage. I arranged a confidential meeting with Benjamin Wallace, the managing partner, in a private room at the Chicago Club. Patricia has no idea you own the firm, Benjamin confirmed, looking uncomfortable. None of the partners do except me. The corporate structure through Meridian Ventures keeps everything discreet. I'm not asking for confidential information about their strategy, I clarified. I won't compromise the firm's ethics. But I need to know if I should recuse myself from any ownership decisions while this proceeds. Benjamin considered this. Legally, you don't need to. The ownership structure is legitimate and was established years before Vanessa joined us. There's no conflict of interest in the technical sense. He paused. But if revealed during proceedings, it could appear problematic, I finished. I understand. We developed a careful approach. I would maintain my ownership position but remove myself from any direct involvement in staffing or case assignments. Benjamin would ensure all documentation regarding the divorce proceedings was properly secured according to standard confidentiality practices. Most importantly, we established that when the appropriate moment came, Benjamin would provide official confirmation of my ownership status. Meanwhile, reports from mutual friends indicated Vanessa had fully embraced her relationship with Roger. She had moved him into our home, the property I had purchased before our marriage and transferred partially to her name as a 5th anniversary gift. She spoke openly about securing half of everything plus penalties in the divorce, apparently confident in Patricia Morgan's abilities. I channeled my emotional energy into work, expanding Meridian Ventures' portfolio with 2 promising tech startups and a renewable energy project. The focused productivity provided distraction from personal turmoil and strengthened my financial position. If Vanessa wanted half of everything would be as robust as possible. As preliminary divorce discussions approached, I wrestled with the ethics of my position. Was I manipulating the situation by withholding information about my ownership of Bennett and Associates? After considerable reflection, I concluded that fairness, not vengeance, justified my approach. I didn't seek to deprive Vanessa of her rightful share of our marital assets, only to prevent her from taking what wasn't hers through manipulative legal tactics. To ensure documentation of Vanessa's infidelity, I reluctantly engaged a private investigator. Traditional divorce proceedings in Illinois didn't technically require proof of adultery, but character evidence could influence property division, especially if one party had misused marital resources to support an affair. The investigator provided photographs, time-stamped records, and witness statements confirming Vanessa and Roger's relationship had indeed begun well before our separation. As the first court date approached, I maintained outward composure while finalizing every detail of my strategy. Unlike Vanessa, I sought no public humiliation or punitive outcomes, only a fair resolution that reflected the true nature of our contributions and conduct within the marriage. The revelation of my ownership would come only if necessary to achieve that fairness. "Are you sure you want to play this card?" Lawrence asked during our final strategy session. "Once revealed, you can't take it back. The professional consequences for Vanessa could be significant." "I don't want to," I admitted. "But she's left me little choice. Patricia's demands are becoming more aggressive by the day." The night before our first significant hearing, Vanessa sent a text message that solidified my resolve. "Ready to lose everything tomorrow? Should have treated me better while you had the chance." I didn't respond. Some battles are won in silence. The preliminary divorce proceedings began with administrative hearings to establish temporary arrangements, while the case moved forward. From the first meeting, Vanessa made her intentions clear, not just through legal demands but through calculated personal displays. She and Roger arrived together at the initial hearing, entering the conference room at Bennett and Associates with theatrical timing. Vanessa wore a designer suit I recognized from our last anniversary trip to Milan, while Roger stayed close beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. The message was unmistakable. She had upgraded to someone she considered more suitable, and wanted me to witness their connection. Patricia Morgan sat opposite me and my attorney, David Whitaker, a respected divorce lawyer from a different firm. I had specifically chosen external representation to maintain ethical boundaries regarding my ownership of Bennett and Associates. "Mr. Turner," Patricia began with professional coolness, "my client is seeking temporary maintenance of $15,000 monthly, exclusive use of the Lakeshore Drive property, and preliminary division of investment accounts to ensure liquidity during proceedings." The demands were excessive by any standard, designed more to establish an aggressive negotiating position than to reflect reasonable needs. David calmly countered with more moderate proposals while I maintained composed silence, observing Vanessa's reactions rather than engaging directly. Throughout this initial phase, Vanessa and Roger made their relationship increasingly visible. They arrived together at every meeting, exchanged affectionate touches clearly intended for my benefit, and whispered comments followed by poorly concealed laughter. Their behavior reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of my character. They believed these displays would provoke emotional reactions that would weaken my position. During one particularly tense negotiation session regarding our investment portfolios, Vanessa interrupted her own attorney to interject. "Marcus never understood long-term financial planning. That's why I need appropriate compensation, to secure the future he couldn't provide." The irony of this statement, given that my financial acumen had built the very wealth she sought to claim, was not lost on those present. David advised me to ignore the provocation, which I did, though I noted how Patricia seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her client's behavior. As preliminary discussions continued, I instructed David to appear relatively conciliatory on minor issues while firmly protecting my premarital assets and business interests. This approach created an impression of reasonable compromise that contrasted with Vanessa's increasingly entitled demands. Patricia, though professionally obligated to advocate for her client, began showing subtle signs of recognizing the imbalance. "My client rejects the proposed temporary arrangement," she stated during our third meeting, though her tone lacked conviction. "Mrs. Turner requires full access to all accounts established during the marriage, regardless of contribution source." David responded with documentary evidence of my separate property interests, established before marriage and maintained with clear financial boundaries throughout. Patricia reviewed these materials with a deepening furrow in her brow, occasionally glancing at Vanessa with what appeared to be growing concern. Meanwhile, Benjamin provided regular updates on the firm's general perspective. "The associates are talking," he confided during a secure call. "Patricia's uncomfortable with some of the demands she's being asked to make. She's a tough negotiator but ethical. Roger's influence on Vanessa is becoming obvious to everyone." As we approached the formal court hearing for preliminary asset division, Vanessa's confidence appeared to grow despite her attorney's caution. She arrived at a financial disclosure meeting wearing a new diamond bracelet that I recognized as being significantly more expensive than anything I had gifted her during our marriage. "Do you like it?" she asked, noticing my glance. "Roger understands the value of proper appreciation." I said nothing, but made a note to include the expensive gift in our documentation of potentially misused marital funds. If Roger was purchasing luxury items for Vanessa while she claimed financial need for temporary support, this contradiction would be relevant to the court. The night before the critical preliminary hearing, I reviewed our strategy once more with David and Lawrence. All necessary documentation was prepared. Comprehensive financial records, evidence of separate property, time-stamped records of Vanessa's infidelity, and most crucially, the certified ownership documents for Bennett and Associates through Meridian Ventures. "We present this only if absolutely necessary," I instructed. "I'd prefer to reach a fair settlement without it." "And if she continues pushing for half your premarital assets?" Lawrence asked. "Then we'll have no choice," I replied. "The ethical breach is on their side. Having a firm represent someone against its own owner creates an inherent conflict of interest." That evening, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotional weight of the situation. Despite Vanessa's betrayal and the collapse of our marriage, I took no pleasure in the confrontation ahead. What had once been love had transformed into a business transaction with hostile parties, a profound failure regardless of legal outcomes. I slept little that night, waking before dawn to prepare mentally for the day ahead. My morning ritual was deliberate and grounding: a 5-mile run along the lakefront, a cold shower, meditation, and a careful selection of my most conservative charcoal suit. Armor of a different kind for a different type of battle. As I drove downtown through morning traffic, Vanessa sent another text. "Hope you're ready to start over with nothing. Maybe this will teach you to pay attention to what matters." I didn't respond, but her continued antagonism reinforced my resolve. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth and consequences. The Cook County Courthouse stood imposing against the clear October sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. I arrived 45 minutes early, meeting David in the lobby to review our final approach. We settled into courtroom 2103, a wood-paneled chamber with high ceilings and portrait-lined walls that had witnessed countless marital dissolutions. "Judge Henderson is presiding," David whispered as we arranged documents at our table. "She's fair but expects absolute preparation and honesty. No grandstanding or emotional appeals." The courtroom gradually filled with the day's scheduled cases and their respective attorneys. At precisely 9:28, the double doors opened to reveal Vanessa and Roger, followed by Patricia Morgan. Vanessa had chosen a conservative navy suit that projected both professionalism and victimhood, a calculated appearance decision. Roger, in contrast, wore an ostentatious light gray suit with a pocket square that matched Vanessa's blouse, a coordinated visual statement of their union. They took their seats at the opposing table, Vanessa leaning to whisper something to Roger that produced a smirk directed my way. Patricia arranged her documents with methodical precision, her expression neutral but tense. I maintained my focus forward, acknowledging their presence with only a slight nod. At 9:30 sharp, the bailiff called the room to attention. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Eleanor Henderson presiding." Judge Henderson entered briskly, a woman in her 60s with silver hair cut in a practical bob and reading glasses perched on a chain around her neck. She took her seat, surveyed the room with practiced efficiency, and began working through the morning docket. 2 minor cases preceded ours, both resolved with preliminary orders in less than 20 minutes each. At 10:15, the bailiff called, "Turner vs. Turner, preliminary asset division and temporary support hearing." David and I approached the plaintiff's table while Patricia, Vanessa, and Roger took their positions opposite. Roger had been instructed to sit in the gallery since he wasn't a party to the case, but Vanessa had insisted he remain beside her for emotional support, a request Patricia had reluctantly forwarded to the court. Judge Henderson reviewed the case summary before addressing the attorneys. I understand this is a contested dissolution with significant property division questions. Ms. Morgan, as counsel for the petitioner, please present your client's position. Patricia rose with professional composure. Thank you, Your Honor. My client, Vanessa Turner, is seeking equitable division of marital assets accumulated during 12 years of marriage to respondent Marcus Turner. Mrs. Turner contributed significantly to the marriage both through her career as an attorney and by supporting Mr. Turner's business ventures with her legal expertise and partnership. She proceeded to outline demands that had grown even more aggressive since our last negotiation session: 50% of all business holdings regardless of acquisition date, exclusive ownership of our primary residence, ongoing support payments, and a substantial portion of future earnings from investments initiated during the marriage. Throughout Patricia's presentation, Vanessa maintained a slight smile, occasionally glancing my way to gauge reaction. Roger's hand rested on her shoulder in a display of solidarity that seemed choreographed for my benefit. Their confidence bordered on arrogance, clearly assuming the legal system would automatically award Vanessa half of everything simply because she asked. When Patricia concluded, Judge Henderson turned to David. Counsel for the respondent, your position, please. David approached the matter with calculated restraint. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the need for equitable division of actual marital assets. However, Mr. Turner contests the characterization of certain properties as marital assets when clear documentation establishes them as separate property acquired before marriage or through inheritance. He presented our initial financial disclosures, highlighting the distinct separation between my premarital business interests and those developed during our marriage. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have documentation regarding conduct during the marriage that bears relevance to equitable distribution considerations. This reference to Vanessa's infidelity caused a visible reaction. Patricia straightened in her chair while Vanessa's smile faltered momentarily. Judge Henderson, ever focused on legal rather than emotional factors, asked both attorneys to approach the bench for a brief discussion about admissibility of such evidence at this preliminary stage. Upon returning to his seat, David continued outlining our position on temporary arrangements, proposing reasonable support, and housing provisions that acknowledge Vanessa's legitimate needs without capitulating to excessive demands. Throughout his presentation, I maintained composed attention, avoiding direct eye contact with Vanessa and Roger. Judge Henderson, known for her thorough approach, began examining the financial disclosures in detail. She paused at the documentation regarding Meridian Ventures, the holding company through which I own various businesses including Bennett and Associates. I note some inconsistency in the ownership documentation for certain assets, she observed, reviewing the papers carefully. Specifically regarding Meridian Ventures and its subsidiaries. She looked up at Patricia. Ms. Morgan, has your firm performed due diligence on the corporate structure of the respondent's business holdings? Patricia appeared momentarily confused. Yes, Your Honor. We've reviewed all disclosed documents regarding Mr. Turner's business interests. Judge Henderson turned a page in the file. I'm particularly interested in Bennett and Associates, which appears as a subsidiary of Meridian Ventures in these documents. There seems to be relevant information regarding ownership structure that bears on these proceedings. Patricia glanced down at her notes, clearly searching for referenced information. Bennett and Associates is a law firm of record in these proceedings, Your Honor, but not directly relevant to asset division except as it pertains to Mrs. Turner's employment income. At this moment, Benjamin Wallace, who had been seated quietly in the gallery, approached the bailiff and handed over a sealed envelope. The bailiff delivered it to Judge Henderson, who opened and reviewed its contents with increasing interest. After a moment of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, Judge Henderson looked up, first at me, then at Patricia and Vanessa. Ms. Morgan, are you aware that Bennett and Associates, where you and Mrs. Turner are both employed, is wholly owned by Meridian Ventures, which in turn is owned by the respondent, Mr. Turner? The courtroom atmosphere transformed instantly. Patricia's professional composure cracked as she stared first at the judge, then at me with dawning comprehension. Your Honor, That information was not. Judge Henderson turned directly to me. Mr. Turner, as the owner of this law firm, would you like to proceed with Mrs. Turner's legal representation? The moment crystallized in perfect clarity. Vanessa's expression transformed from smug certainty to shocked disbelief, her mouth actually opening slightly as the implications registered. Roger's confusion was equally evident as he leaned toward Vanessa, whispering urgently while maintaining his public composure. I responded carefully, conscious of the gravity of the moment. Your Honor, I have intentionally retained outside counsel to avoid any potential conflict of interest. I have not accessed any privileged information regarding my wife's case through my ownership position. However, the inherent conflict does exist and should be addressed appropriately. Patricia Morgan stood, her professional training reasserting itself despite obvious distress. Your Honor, I must request immediate withdrawal as counsel for Mrs. Turner. This represents an insurmountable conflict of interest that I was not made aware of. Her voice held a note of betrayal as she glanced at Vanessa. Had I known this fundamental fact, I would never have accepted the case. Murmurs spread through the courtroom as the dramatic revelation rippled outward. Judge Henderson called for order with a sharp rap of her gavel. This is highly irregular, she stated, her expression stern. Mrs. Turner will need to secure new counsel immediately. These proceedings cannot continue under the current representation. Vanessa finally found her voice, rising to address the court directly. This is a deliberate deception, Your Honor. He concealed this information to sabotage my case. Judge Henderson regarded her coolly. Mrs. Turner, the court will determine what constitutes deception in these proceedings. The fact remains that your husband's ownership of your employer creates a clear conflict of interest that must be remedied before we can proceed. During this exchange, I noticed Roger quietly gathering his belongings. As Judge Henderson consulted her calendar regarding rescheduling, he leaned to whisper something to Vanessa, then slipped toward the exit. His departure was so smooth, so calculated, that it momentarily distracted from the procedural discussion. Vanessa noticed seconds later, turning to find the empty seat beside her. The abandonment registered visibly on her face, a flash of vulnerability quickly masked by renewed anger directed at me. Judge Henderson declared a 2-week continuance to allow Vanessa to secure new representation, adding that the court would review all previously filed documents for potential conflicts. As we prepared to leave, Patricia Morgan approached David and me with rigid professionalism. I want to state for the record that I had no knowledge of this situation, she said, her voice low but intense. This places me in an untenable professional position. No one is suggesting you knew, I assured her. The ownership structure is deliberately discreet for legitimate business purposes. I've maintained strict separation between my ownership role and these proceedings. She nodded curtly before returning to gather her materials, her career concerns evident in her tight expression. As the courtroom cleared, I remained seated, allowing Vanessa to leave first. She paused at our table, leaning down to deliver a final comment, her voice trembling with rage and something that might have been reluctant respect. Well played, Marcus. I didn't think you had it in you. I met her gaze directly for the first time that day. This isn't a game to me, Vanessa. It never was. Judge Henderson's courtroom emptied quickly, but the reverberations of what had transpired continued in the marble hallway outside. I remained seated at our table, reviewing documents with David while giving Vanessa space to exit first. This courtesy went unreciprocated. She waited in the corridor, clearly intending a confrontation away from the judge's oversight. You manipulated this entire situation, she accused as I emerged, her voice low but intense. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't disguise the flush of humiliation on her cheeks. You deliberately let me hire Patricia, knowing it would create this conflict. I maintained measured calmness. I didn't suggest you hire anyone from Bennett and Associates. That was your decision entirely. You should have disclosed your ownership immediately. To whom? You. The wife who was having an affair with a colleague and planning to take half my premarital assets. Or to Patricia, who would have been professionally obligated to share that information with you. I kept my voice level despite her escalating tone. I disclosed everything legally required to the court at the appropriate time. David stood slightly apart, giving us privacy while remaining present enough to intervene if necessary. Courthouse staff and other attorneys passed by, some slowing noticeably at the tension between us. "Where's Roger?" I asked, noticing his conspicuous absence. Vanessa's expression tightened. "He had an urgent client matter. In the middle of what he knew was an important hearing for you. Interesting prioritization." Before she could respond, Patricia Morgan approached, maintaining professional distance but clearly needing to address the situation. "Mrs. Turner, I need to speak with you about transition arrangements. I've filed my formal withdrawal with the clerk, but you'll need representation immediately to maintain scheduled deadlines." The reality of her situation appeared to fully register with Vanessa then, not just the courtroom setback but the professional complications. As an associate at Bennett & Associates, she had effectively sued the firm's owner while using the firm's resources. The ethical entanglements extended well beyond the divorce proceedings. "What does this mean for my position at the firm?" she asked Patricia directly. Patricia's discomfort was evident. "That's not for me to determine. But I would suggest securing both new counsel and exploring your employment options promptly." As Patricia excused herself to speak with the court clerk, Vanessa turned back to me, calculation replacing anger in her expression. "We can still resolve this reasonably, Marcus. The ownership issue is separate from our marriage dissolution. I'm entitled to fair division regardless." "I agree completely," I replied, surprising her. "You're entitled to your share of actual marital assets acquired during our marriage through joint effort. Not my premarital businesses, not my family inheritance, and certainly not punitive additional percentages for perceived emotional injuries. I can make this very public," she threatened. "How you deceived your wife, hid assets." "I've hidden nothing from the court," I interrupted gently. "All assets are fully disclosed in filings. And public allegations would raise questions about your professional judgment in having an affair with a married colleague while seeking representation from your husband's company. I don't think either of us benefits from that narrative." The strategic shift was visible in her expression, from offensive aggression to damage control. For the first time since our separation, Vanessa appeared to recognize she had overplayed her position. Our conversation ended inconclusively as David indicated we needed to leave for another appointment. As we walked toward the elevator, he commented quietly, "Roger's disappearing act was remarkably quick." "Not surprising," I replied. "Men who betray their families rarely show courage when complications arise." The following days brought significant developments. Through professional channels, I learned Roger had requested emergency personal leave from Bennett & Associates immediately following the hearing. Subsequent information confirmed he had returned to his family home in Lake Forest, apparently attempting reconciliation with his wife after she had been anonymously informed of his affair with Vanessa. Vanessa secured new counsel within the week, a respected attorney from a downtown firm specializing in high-asset divorces. Their initial communication struck a noticeably more reasonable tone, focusing on legitimate marital assets rather than aggressive claims against my separate property. Meanwhile, Patricia Morgan submitted her formal resignation from Bennett & Associates, citing the untenable professional position created by the undisclosed conflict. Though I had no direct involvement in personnel matters, Benjamin informed me she had secured a position with a competing firm within days, her professional reputation intact despite the uncomfortable situation. Vanessa's professional circumstances proved more complicated. Though no direct termination occurred, I had specifically instructed Benjamin to handle the situation without punitive action. Her position became increasingly uncomfortable as colleagues learned of the courtroom revelation. The firm restructured departments 2 weeks later, reassigning Vanessa's major clients to other associates due to resource optimization. When divorce proceedings resumed with Vanessa's new representation, the tone had transformed completely. Gone were the excessive demands and emotional manipulations. Her attorney presented reasonable positions focused on actual marital assets, presumably after reviewing the strength of documentation regarding my separate property. Judge Henderson, clearly noting the shift, commented during our return hearing. "I appreciate counsel's focused approach to legitimate marital property. It allows the court to address actual legal questions rather than emotional grievances." The final settlement negotiations proceeded efficiently once the boundaries of marital versus separate property were established. Vanessa received fair division of assets actually acquired during our marriage, investment accounts we had built together, art and furnishings purchased jointly, and appropriate temporary support while she transitioned professionally. My premarital business holdings, including Meridian Ventures and all its subsidiaries, remained my separate property with documentation clearly establishing their acquisition timeline. The lakefront home, which I had purchased before our marriage but partially transferred to joint ownership as an anniversary gift, was sold with proceeds divided proportionate to legal ownership percentage. Throughout this process, Roger remained conspicuously absent from Vanessa's life. Through mutual connections, I learned his wife had demanded his complete separation from Vanessa as a condition of attempting marital reconciliation. His professional standing at Bennett and Associates diminished as the full story circulated among partners, with several major clients requesting different representation due to concerns about judgment. 3 months after the courtroom revelation, Vanessa submitted her resignation from Bennett and Associates, accepting a position with a smaller firm in Milwaukee. A lateral move at best, possibly even a step backward professionally. The geographic distance suggested a desire for fresh start away from the professional consequences of her choices. Our divorce was finalized 6 months after proceedings began, with considerably less drama than its earlier stages had suggested. The final hearing was brief and businesslike, with Judge Henderson commenting on the appropriate resolution reflecting actual marital contributions rather than emotional claims. As we left the courtroom for the final time, Vanessa approached me in the hallway. The anger and calculation had faded from her expression, replaced by something more complex, perhaps regret, perhaps simply exhaustion. "I underestimated you," she said quietly. "I always thought your kindness was weakness." "It never was," I replied. "It was a choice." She nodded slightly before turning away. We haven't spoken directly since that day. 6 months after the divorce finalization, spring arrived in Chicago with particular vibrancy, as if nature itself was emphasizing the cycles of ending and renewal. I had maintained the downtown apartment, finding unexpected comfort in establishing a space that was entirely my own, without layers of shared history or compromise. The initial weeks following the divorce had been challenging despite the favorable legal outcome. 12 years of partnership leaves imprints that legal documents cannot erase. Habits of thought, reflexive considerations of another's preferences, the automatic reach across an empty bed. I allowed myself to experience these moments rather than suppress them, recognizing them as part of the necessary healing process. My business interests provided productive focus during this transition. Meridian Ventures expanded into sustainable infrastructure projects across the Midwest, creating both profitable investments and positive community impact. Bennett and Associates stabilized after the departure of Vanessa and Roger, with Benjamin implementing governance improvements that strengthened the firm's professional culture. What surprised me most was the gradual return of genuine joy, not merely the absence of conflict but actual positive anticipation for each day. I reconnected with friends who had drifted during the more isolated years of my marriage, particularly Lawrence and his wife Susan, whose Sunday dinner invitations became a welcome tradition. "You seem more yourself than you have in years," Lawrence commented during one such evening, as we enjoyed cigars on his back porch while Susan and their daughter played piano inside. "Even before the divorce, something was dimmed." His observation resonated with my own reflections. The marriage's deterioration had been gradual enough that I'd adjusted incrementally to diminishing authenticity and connection, like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water. Freedom brought self-rediscovery that extended beyond romantic relationships into all aspects of life. I expanded personal interests that had been neglected, returning to recreational sailing on Lake Michigan, joining a contemporary literature discussion group at the university, taking weekend motorcycle trips through Wisconsin's winding rural roads. These activities weren't merely distractions but reaffirmations of identity outside the constraints of a failing partnership. Professional success had always come naturally to me, but I found new satisfaction in mentoring younger entrepreneurs. Through a university program, I began advising startup founders navigating their first significant business challenges. Their fresh perspectives and determination reminded me of my own early career passion, creating a rewarding cycle of giving and receiving wisdom. Occasionally, information about Vanessa reached me through mutual connections. She had established herself at the Milwaukee firm but hadn't achieved the rapid advancement she'd previously enjoyed. Roger had indeed reconciled with his wife, though rumors suggested the arrangement was more financial than emotional. These updates no longer triggered emotional response. They were simply information about people who had once been central to my life but now existed on its periphery. 8 months after the divorce, on a crisp October Saturday, I visited a small independent bookstore in Evanston I'd discovered during a weekend exploration. While browsing the history section, I literally bumped into a woman reaching for the same Churchill biography. "Sorry," we both said simultaneously, then laughed at the synchronicity. She introduced herself as Stephanie Carson, the bookstore's owner. Our conversation moved easily from Churchill to historical biographies to the challenges of independent bookselling in the digital age. Before I realized it, an hour had passed in engaging discussion that ranged from business philosophy to favorite childhood reading experiences. "The cafe next door makes incredible almond croissants," she mentioned as our conversation reached a natural pause. "If you're not in a rush." We spent another 2 hours continuing our discussion over pastries and coffee. Stephanie was divorced as well, with a refreshing directness about her experiences and the growth they had prompted. Unlike the calculated charm I'd grown accustomed to in professional and social circles, her authenticity was immediately apparent and deeply refreshing. Our friendship developed organically over subsequent weeks: casual coffee meetings, a photography exhibition she recommended, a sailing invitation on an unusually warm November day. We maintained comfortable space between these interactions, both valuing independence and mindful of past relationship patterns. "I'm not looking to rush into anything serious," she said directly during our 4th or 5th meeting. "I like my life as it is." "I feel exactly the same way," I replied, appreciating her transparency. "I'm still learning who I am outside of my marriage." This mutual understanding created freedom from expectations that allowed genuine connection to develop at its own pace. Whether our friendship eventually evolved into something more remained an open question neither of us felt pressured to answer. The experience with Vanessa had taught valuable lessons about trust and transparency. I had entered that marriage believing love naturally generated honesty, that emotional connection ensured mutual protection. Reality had proven more complex. Trust required ongoing verification through actions, not merely through feelings or promises. The divorce proceedings had similarly transformed my understanding of justice versus revenge. In those courthouse moments when Vanessa realized the extent of her miscalculation, I could have pursued punitive measures, demanded professional consequences, exposed Roger's duplicity to maximum effect, insisted on minimal settlement terms. The opportunity for retribution had been available and perhaps even justified by conventional standards. Yet that path would have diminished my own integrity and extended the emotional entanglement. The most complete victory wasn't humiliating Vanessa but reclaiming my autonomy and ethical framework. Fair outcomes rather than punitive ones allowed forward movement without the burden of lingering resentment. Perhaps most significantly, I learned the importance of appropriate boundaries between private and professional life. My discreet approach to business ownership had begun as simple privacy preference, but evolved into problematic secrecy within my marriage. While Vanessa's actions couldn't be justified, my compartmentalization had contributed to the communication breakdown that preceded them. In my mentoring relationships with young entrepreneurs, I emphasized this balance repeatedly: transparency with key stakeholders while maintaining appropriate privacy, clear communication without overwhelming disclosure, integrity that aligned public and private behavior without erasing boundaries between them. My business continued thriving through thoughtful expansion rather than aggressive acquisition. I established a foundation supporting educational access for first-generation college students, finding unexpected fulfillment in creating opportunities rather than simply accumulating resources. 1 year after the divorce finalization, I received an unexpected letter from Vanessa. Unlike our previous interactions, it contained neither demands nor accusations. Simply a brief acknowledgement of her contributions to our marriage's failure and wishes for my future well-being. I appreciated the gesture without feeling any need to resume contact. Some chapters closed permanently, their lessons incorporated without requiring ongoing relationship. Life after betrayal and divorce wasn't about forgetting, or even necessarily forgiving in the conventional sense. It was about integration, acknowledging these experiences as part of my story without allowing them to dominate my identity or future choices. The pain had been real, the legal battle necessary, but neither defined me beyond their moment in time. The future remains appropriately uncertain. Business opportunities continue emerging, friendships developing, potential romantic connections appearing unexpectedly. The difference now is approaching this uncertainty with curiosity rather than anxiety, with openness to possibilities rather than desperate grabbing for security. If you've stayed with my story this long, perhaps you've experienced similar betrayals or faced decisions about justice versus vengeance in your own life. Have you ever discovered strength in yourself that emerged only when everything familiar was stripped away? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and share if this journey resonated with you. Sometimes our most powerful growth comes precisely when we think we've lost everything.